The house stood at the farthest edge of the fields, a shape of wood and stone that seemed swallowed by the soil around it. From the distance it looked harmless, even plain, the kind of home that should have blended into the rhythm of farm life, yet the air that hung over it was wrong. The fields were full, but the earth gave no sound of life, no insects, no wind through tall stalks, no birds passing over. It was as if the land itself had made a pact of silence with the family who lived there. Travelers slowed their pace when they neared it, some whispering that the house looked too steady, too watchful, like something that had been built not to shelter but to keep. The Jarvis family lived inside. To those who met them briefly in town, they seemed respectable enough. Elias Jarvis, broad-shouldered and slow with his words, spoke like a man committed to the work of the land. His wife, Margaret, drew more attention. Her calm manner, her soft voice, her neat clothing that never seemed marked by dirt, all gave her the look of a woman who kept order not just in her home but in herself. She carried herself as though she were protecting something precious, and people respected that, even if they could not name why. Neighbors nodded politely when they saw her, grateful that she appeared steady in a town full of instability. But when she passed, some admitted later, they felt her eyes linger too long, as though she were taking more than a glance should take. The farmhouse itself was older than most remembered. Records showed it was built by another family, but those stories blurred into rumor. And by the time Elias and Margaret moved in, no one could say what had happened to those who owned it first. The ground around the house bore no graves, though locals often said it felt like one. Livestock avoided the farthest edges of the fields. Children dared each other to touch the fence line, only to run away when the stillness pressed against their ears. Even the most practical farmers could not ignore that the Jarvis land seemed to drink up noise and hold it. Inside, life was quiet in ways that unsettled visitors. Neighbors who stopped by described the absence of sound as unnatural. Doors closed without echo. Footsteps landed with no weight. Even the creak of the old beam seemed swallowed before it could travel. Guests left quickly, remarking later that they could not explain why their chest felt tight while sitting at the Jarvis table. Margaret would smile at them as they left, her expression polite but unshaken, as if she expected their discomfort. Elias would walk them to the door, saying little, his silence heavy but not hostile. Together they seemed to live within a rhythm that no outsider could join. What no one knew was how deliberate that silence was. The land had not grown mute by chance. The family had nurtured it, cultivated quiet like another crop. Margaret in particular believed that silence was not just absence but power. She arranged the house so that its walls pressed sound down. She set rules for Elias that few noticed, instructing him not to whistle, not to hum, not even to clear his throat unless outside. The house became a vessel for stillness, a chamber where noise did not belong. To her, silence meant control, and control meant purity. The neighbors only saw a tidy home, but within its order lay a doctrine few could imagine. At night, the fields darkened until they seemed endless, the house sitting in the center like a sealed jar. Those who passed by after dusk swore they saw no lamps through the windows, only faint shadows moving behind curtains. They hurried along, unwilling to admit how deeply the place unsettled them. The Jarvis home was a place that invited no trust, yet it gathered none of the suspicion it deserved. In time, the house would reveal what it had always been. Not a shelter for a family, but a container for something darker. Something that grew stronger each time silence was obeyed. Margaret Jarvis moved through the town like a figure carved out of calmness. She kept her hair tied back neatly, her hands folded when she listened, her voice never raised above the soft hum of courtesy. To the mothers she visited, she seemed endlessly patient. To the priests, she appeared devout, always kneeling with eyes lowered as though humility were her nature. When she offered to take in children that others could not raise, no one questioned her motives. They praised her as a woman who sacrificed her own comfort for the good of the helpless. Over time, they began to believe she carried a gift, a strange grace for caring where others faltered. People wanted to believe in her kindness because believing otherwise would have meant facing a truth they could not live with. Margaret built her image carefully. When she walked through the market, she carried a basket not only for food but for small trinkets she gave freely to children who ran barefoot in the dust. She bent low to meet their eyes, pressed sweets into their palms, and murmured blessings that left mothers teary. When she spoke about the nursery she ran, she described it as a haven where abandoned children could find safety, where silence would protect them from the chaos of the world. Townspeople nodded with approval, too eager to believe they had found a saint among them. They never wondered why the children she kept were rarely seen in daylight, or why their laughter never reached the roads. The nursery itself became Margaret's stage. Those allowed inside saw orderly rows of blankets and simple wooden cribs. The air smelled of herbs she burned in clay pots, sweet enough to mask any darker scent. The children she showed to visitors looked tidy, their clothes scrubbed, their hair brushed flat. They sat still when she spoke, their hands resting quietly in their laps, their eyes lowered in mimicry of her own. Guests remarked on how well-behaved they were, marveling at her ability to instill discipline where most children rebelled. Margaret only smiled faintly, accepting their praise as if it embarrassed her. Yet deep inside, she savored the success of her performance. She knew she had convinced them. What no one saw was the truth beneath her smile. Margaret did not see the children as lives to protect, but as pieces of a design only she understood. In her private mind, she believed that children were not born as individuals, but as raw material, unshaped and unfinished. She thought of herself not as a mother, but as a sculptor of flesh and spirit. Every child who entered her care was stripped of identity. Names were replaced with numbers, cries were treated as impurities, movements as flaws. She kept journals filled with observations of their bodies, their breathing, their weaknesses. To her, every trembling hand or restless eye was not a sign of suffering, but a flaw to be corrected. She treated suffering as a form of cleansing, a necessary stage in her quiet work. Her methods of correction were gentle enough at first to appear like care. She would stroke a child's hair while depriving them of food, whispering that hunger taught stillness. She would sing softly while forcing them to hold positions for hours, their small bodies aching until exhaustion dragged them down. She called this patience training, though what she truly sought was submission so deep it erased the will to resist. She believed silence was purity, and purity was the only state worth preserving. Each time a child fell quiet under her rules, she wrote a mark of triumph in her journals, noting that the material was closer to perfection. The town saw none of this. They saw only the woman who donated to the poor, who comforted grieving mothers, who spoke with priests about the holiness of protecting children. They admired her restraint, her composure, her willingness to take burdens no one else wanted. They spoke of her as though she were touched by divine purpose, and in a way she was. But her purpose was not divine. It was an obsession that fed on innocence itself, an obsession that demanded she continue gathering children not to save them but to shape them, unmake them, and in some cases preserve them as silent testaments to her will. Margaret Jarvis became a figure of trust, not because she was trustworthy, but because people needed her to be. They could not bear to imagine that the gentle woman with folded hands and calm eyes might see children not as lives, but as designs waiting to be carved. It was easier to believe in her kindness than to confront the emptiness beneath it. And while they believed, she continued her work in silence, preparing the children not for life but for the plans only she would ever understand. Beneath the Jarvis farmhouse, hidden under planks polished to an innocent shine, lay the place where Margaret's truest work began. The door to it was not obvious, but it was there for anyone who knew where to step. A single loose board shifted to reveal iron, hinges the kind forged long ago and oiled often enough to never creak. When the trap opened, the air that rose carried no trace of soil or dampness. It carried the clean, sharp scent of lime, soap, and dried herbs. Margaret had designed it that way. She wanted no smell of decay, no reminder of what this space would one day hold. To her mind, purity began with cleanliness, and so she carved purity into every surface of the place she called the nursery. The descent was narrow, steps carved into earth and shored up by stone. Margaret taught the older children to walk down them without looking back. For the younger ones, she used a pulley system, small cradles she had fitted with ropes. They were lowered into the darkness with the same care she might have given to lowering baskets of fruit into storage. Once inside, there was no climbing out again. The weight of the trapdoor, the arrangement of the stairs, the walls pressed close, it was all deliberate. Children were to remain below. Above was the world, and the world was something she believed must be stripped from them. The underground nursery stretched wider than most would have guessed. Margaret had ordered Elias to dig it over years, telling him it was for food storage, then for storm shelter, then for the safekeeping of tools. He never argued. He swung his spade in silence, cutting the earth deeper, shaping chambers that grew larger than any storm cellar should have been. Margaret oversaw the work with calm calculation, smoothing walls, setting stone where soil might crumble, sealing in the shape of her design. By the end, what had once been raw ground had become a place she could almost call holy. The room was arranged like a chapel. Candles stood in iron holders along the walls, never smoking, trimmed short so the light was steady but dim. Wooden cribs were placed in neat rows, each covered with clean linens Margaret washed by hand. She draped white cloth across the ceiling beams, giving the illusion of a canopy, as though the room were blessed. At the far end of the chamber stood a table dressed like an altar. On it she placed her journals, jars of herbs, and small bowls she used for measuring powders. She did not see herself as a caretaker here, but as a priestess in a temple, and the children were her congregation. For the children, descent into this chamber was the beginning of silence. Their cries echoed only faintly against stone, muffled by the layers of earth above. Margaret discouraged noise from the start, standing over their cribs with her calm stare, pressing her finger to her lips. She whispered that quiet was safety, that stillness was goodness, that every sound they made was a mark against them. Over time, fear welded itself to her rules, and children learned not to wail for the world they could no longer see. To visitors who might one day glance into the nursery, Margaret maintained a sense of order that disguised cruelty as discipline. She showed clean beds, well-fed, children, tidy corners. She explained that she kept them below ground to protect them from storms, from wolves, from sickness that carried through open air. Most believed her, too grateful that someone had taken unwanted children into her care to question the choice. They saw the chapel-like neatness and mistook it for devotion, never realizing it was only the stage dressing of her obsession. What no one could sense was how the underground pressed upon the children's minds. Days bled into nights without windows. The candles gave no sense of time. Margaret controlled every hour, deciding when they woke, when they ate, when they slept. She moved among them like a figure of judgment, adjusting sheets, touching foreheads, recording observations. To her, they were not children growing, but material being shaped. Every moment of silence, every movement suppressed, every tear dried before it could fall, was proof that she was closer to her vision. The floorboards above hid everything. Neighbors walked past the farmhouse and never guessed that beneath their feet children sat in rows, learning to breathe in unison, learning to accept the underground as the only world they might ever know. And as Margaret moved between her false kindness above and her ritual of discipline below, she smiled to herself, certain she had built more than a nursery. She had built a sanctuary for her own idea of purity, a place where the world's noise could never reach, and where silence would last longer than any sunlight. Margaret Jarvis believed sleep was the first step toward purity. A still body, an empty mind, a quiet breath. These were signs of obedience, signs that the chaos of the outside world was slipping away. She called it rest, but it was never rest in the natural sense. It was the training ground for her designs, a way of shaping children into forms that belonged more to her than to themselves. The underground nursery became a place where sleep was engineered, silence enforced, and every sound measured against her rules. She began with breathing. To Margaret, breathing was too wild, too uneven, too human, so she built devices to control it. Simple machines at first, bellows tied to ropes, pulleys that pushed and pulled air in steady rhythm. She would bind small leather straps around the children's chests, linking them to these devices, forcing their lungs to rise and fall with mechanical precision. To her, this was harmony, the child's body joining the rhythm she believed was divine. The children learned quickly that struggling brought pain. Resisting the straps left them bruised, coughing, and exhausted. Over time, most surrendered, their breathing falling into the same steady pattern. Margaret wrote in her journals that they were closer to angels when they slept like machines. Food became her next method. She fed them milk, sweetened just enough to please their tongues, but always laced with her mixtures. Dried roots she ground into powders, herbs she brewed into bitter syrups, and at times tinctures that dulled thought itself. She called it medicine, though no illness existed beyond their own fear. These mixtures made them sluggish, their limbs heavy, their eyes slow to focus. In that state, she could lay them down in their cribs, watch their lids close, and know they would not wake until she allowed. To outsiders, she explained the use of herbs as a way of soothing restless children. No one questioned her because the children seemed calm, and calmness was mistaken for care. But the deepest rule was silence. Margaret believed sound was the seed of disobedience. She told herself that every cry was proof of corruption, every laugh a sign of defiance, every word a betrayal of the stillness she worshipped. So she trained them with punishment that was quiet but unforgettable. If a child whimpered, she pressed a cold spoon of bitter liquid against their tongue until they gagged, teaching them to associate sound with poison. If one cried too long, she tied cloth around their head, muffling them until breath became desperate. If they spoke when she had not given permission, she left them in darkness for hours, stripped of blankets, forced to lie still in cold silence. Slowly, the children learned. They swallowed tears before they could fall, pressed lips shut against sobs, and spoke only in whispers when she was not near. The absence of noise became not only survival, but the rule of their world. Margaret saw these changes not as cruelty, but as progress. In her mind, she was cleansing them, carving away weakness until only stillness remained. She wrote that silence was the highest form of innocence because silence could not sin. She told herself she was protecting them from the noise of life, from the voices that might have told them they were unwanted, from the world that had abandoned them. Yet in truth, she was stripping them of the only defense they had, their ability to be heard. At night, when the children lay bound by rhythm, drugged into dreamless sleep, Margaret walked among their cribs with the satisfaction of an artist surveying her work. She watched the rise and fall of their chests, all moving together as if they were one body instead of many. The silence pleased her most. No crying, no laughter, no restless whispers. Only the hum of her devices and the faint sigh of breath controlled by her hand. She told herself it was proof that she had built something pure, something greater than what nature had given. And as the candles burned low, she wrote again in her journals, marking each child not by their name, but by their success in surrender. She believed stillness made them pure. What she could not see was that purity to her meant erasure, and with each night of silence, she was erasing them one breath at a time. Margaret's obsession with stillness grew into ritual, and ritual demanded a stage. For her, the cribs she once laid children in were no longer enough. She began designing what she called her weighted cradles. Wooden frames hung by iron chains fixed deep into beams above the underground chamber. To anyone else, they would have looked crude, like swings built from coffin wood, but to Margaret they were sacred instruments. She spent months refining them, sanding the edges smooth, lining them with soft cloth, painting them in pale colors as though kindness could disguise their purpose. When the first cradle hung steady in the candlelight, swaying faintly with the air, she knew she had created something worthy of her doctrine. Infants were the first to be placed inside. Margaret wrapped them in white linen, tied their arms close so they could not thrash, and laid them carefully into the suspended wood. She would watch as their small chests rose and fell, eyes darting in the half-dark, mouths searching for sound. The chains rattled gently when the child stirred, a metallic whisper that pleased her. The cradle itself was bound to a counterweight system, heavy stones tied to ropes that ran through pulleys. The more the infant moved, the more the cradle sank, lowering them inch by inch into pits she had dug beneath the chamber. To Margaret, the descent was a form of cleansing, the child passing into earth like a seed, purified through silence. She believed that only those who surrendered fully deserved to rise again. A still child, one who gave no cry and barely moved, could remain close to the surface, swaying calmly above the pit. But one who resisted, who screamed or writhed, triggered the descent. Down they went, the ropes sliding, the stones clanking, the chains singing a grim lullaby, as the cradle sank lower into the hollow. The child's voice was swallowed by soil, their sound pressed away by depth, until only the dim rattling of chains marked their presence at all. Margaret recorded these rituals carefully. In her journals she wrote of purity earned through stillness, of weakness revealed by noise. She did not call the infants children. She called them blossoms in trial. She believed that those who failed to still themselves were rejecting her gift of silence, and their descent was punishment as much as it was lesson. Many cradles never rose again. She left them hanging in darkness, some deep in pits where no hand reached, rows of emptiness swaying faintly whenever the earth shifted. To her, this emptiness was beautiful, proof that silence had triumphed where noise had once lived. The older children watched the ritual in fear. They saw the infants lowered and did not always see them return. Margaret used this fear as another tool. She told them that silence could save them from descent, that only those who obeyed would remain in the light of the candles. The children learned to hold their breath, to freeze their bodies, to live each hour as though a single sound could condemn them. Their fear became its own chain, binding them more tightly than iron ever could. Margaret herself grew calmer with each ritual. She stood by the cradles as though attending Mass, hands folded, lips moving in prayers only she understood. When a child grew still and the cradle stopped lowering, she smiled faintly, convinced she had brought them closer to purity. When a cradle descended beyond reach, she bowed her head as though in mourning, though what she mourned was not the child but the weakness she believed had ruined them. In truth, she felt pride in these losses because each one proved her system worked. The chamber became a forest of suspended wood and iron, rows of cradles swaying in silence. To any who might have looked upon it, it would have seemed a place of horror, a graveyard of innocence disguised as nursery. But to Margaret it was order made visible, silence carved into ritual, proof that she had reshaped the most fragile lives into instruments of her will. Above ground she continued to wear her face of kindness, the woman who soothed the poor and comforted the grieving. Below she tended to her swaying garden of weighted cradles, each one a symbol of her belief that dissent was cleansing and silence was salvation. When the infants were bound to their cradles below, Margaret turned her attention to the older children, those who had already learned to walk, but not yet learned to submit. For them she built what she called the mirror garden. It was not a garden in any natural sense. It was a maze of narrow halls lined with polished metal and shards of glass she had collected over years. Each panel reflected dim candlelight, and every movement stretching small faces into endless corridors of repetition. When a child entered, they found themselves multiplied into dozens of copies, surrounded by their own reflection, with no path forward that did not show their own frightened eyes. Margaret described the place as a chamber of reflection. She told herself it was meant to strip away distraction, to force children to confront themselves until they saw nothing else. In truth, it was a trap for the mind. The mirrored walls warped every sound into echoes, every breath into whispers, every cry into a chorus that grew louder until silence seemed safer than speech. Hours inside these halls felt endless. The children's feet pressed against stone that seemed to stretch longer with each step. No matter which way they turned, their own image followed, pale and frightened, lips trembling, eyes wide with dread. Margaret guided them into the chamber with the same calm she used above ground. She spoke softly, promising that reflection was the path to purity. She explained that the mirrors did not lie, that what they saw was the truth of themselves, multiplied so they could not ignore it. Once the heavy door closed, her voice disappeared and only their own remained, repeating back at them until it broke. Some children lasted only hours before collapsing, pressing their bodies against cold stone, hiding their faces from endless eyes. Others wandered for days, too afraid to sleep, too afraid to close their eyes in a place where their reflection was always watching. Hunger and thirst grew sharp, but Margaret allowed no relief until silence had settled into them fully. She waited, listening outside, her ear pressed to the door. The cries always came at first, then the pleading, then the screams that turned raw, but eventually sound gave way to quiet, either through exhaustion or something deeper. That was the moment she opened the door and declared the reflection successful. In her journals, she recorded these trials with the same motherly tone she used in public. She wrote of children who had reached understanding, who had found purity in stillness. She did not describe their cracked voices, their hollow eyes, their trembling hands. Instead, she wrote as though they had been blessed, as though their silence was a gift they had chosen. When one child refused to stop screaming until their voice broke entirely, she wrote that they had been stubborn but were finally given the gift of wordless existence. The language was gentle, but the truth was devastating. Some did not emerge whole. Margaret left them inside too long, waiting for a silence that never came. Their minds fractured, and when they were released, they could no longer recognize themselves or anyone else. They wandered the underground halls, muttering half-words, clutching at air, staring into walls as though mirrors still surrounded them. Margaret did not call this failure, she called it transformation. She believed madness was another form of cleansing, that in losing the self, they had become closer to the purity she sought. The mirror garden soon filled her with pride. She looked at its polished walls and saw not cruelty but devotion. Every child who left that place silent or broken was proof to her that her methods worked. She saw herself not as tormentor but as teacher, guiding them to shed the noise of life, stripping away even the memory of laughter or speech. She spoke to her journals as though to a congregation, explaining that reflection was a blessing and silence was salvation. To those who lived outside, Margaret remained the face of kindness, the mother who cared for unwanted children. None of them ever walked through the mirror garden. None of them ever saw the way reflection became punishment, or how silence was carved not by love but by terror. Yet beneath the farmhouse, the mirrored halls stood waiting, always ready to swallow another child into endless repetition, until they could no longer tell where their reflection ended and their mind began. Margaret's obsession turned from discipline to something far darker. It was no longer enough for her to silence children, no longer enough to strip them of words and laughter. She wanted to see if she could undo what she called the flaws of creation itself. She believed every child was built incorrectly, their bodies filled with excess, their shapes crude and unfinished. To her, God had made them raw, and it was her duty to refine them. She called it unbuilding, though in truth it was the science of destruction masked as devotion. She began with starvation, but not starvation left to chance. Margaret studied how flesh disappeared from the body when deprived, recording in her journals how cheeks sank first, how collarbones rose, how skin clung to bone. She did not starve them equally, she controlled it, feeding small amounts to certain parts of the body while withholding from others. She arranged meals with mathematical precision, measuring spoonfuls of milk, scraps of bread, slices of fruit, not to sustain life but to sculpt its decline. She called it shaping, as though she were an artist with clay. The children became her statues, their thin arms and hollow eyes etched into patterns she recognized as progress. When bones grew visible, she grew fascinated. She would trace their edges with her fingers, murmuring that the body was finally showing its true form. She encouraged the body's collapse as though it were bloom, guiding it toward sharp lines and exposed joints. To her, every rib was a mark of achievement, every sunken stomach a step closer to purity. She wrote that softness was corruption, that the roundness of a child's body was evidence of nature's mistake. To unbuild them was to remove the mistake, to strip them down to the core of what she believed they should be. Margaret's study became a place of preservation. When a child succumbed to her experiments, she did not bury them. She cleaned them carefully, washing skin until it shone pale, combing hair flat as though for a portrait. She then preserved them in her underground chamber, arranging their remains with the precision of a collector. Some she left whole, lying in glass cases lined with white cloth, their bodies frozen in the silence she demanded. Others she dismantled carefully, separating bones, arranging them by size and shape, labeling them with notes written in her steady hand. She displayed them not as victims, but as exhibits of her work, proof that unbuilding was possible. The journals she kept during this time were chilling in their calmness. She wrote of her children as though they were blossoms in a garden, praising the way their bodies gave up excess, the way their eyes grew too large for their faces, the way their hands shrank into claws of delicate bone. She never mentioned pain, though she recorded every stage of collapse. Her language was soft, motherly, describing starvation as refinement, death as perfection. She seemed unaware that what she called unbuilding was nothing less than erasure. Some remains she treated with chemicals she mixed herself, drawing on scraps of knowledge from medical pamphlets and old texts she had gathered. She soaked small bodies in baths that slowed decay, suspending them in glass jars as though they were specimens meant for study. She gave each a label, not with their names, but with virtues she imagined for them: patience, purity, stillness, obedience. To Margaret, these jars were not grotesque. They were her triumphs, a library of silence that proved she had undone creation and remade it in her vision. Visitors who glimpsed the upper rooms never saw this collection. They saw only Margaret's calm eyes, her folded hands, her careful smile. They heard her speak gently about caring for children, never knowing that beneath their feet she had built a museum of the unmade. For her, this secrecy was part of the ritual. To reveal the work would have been to cheapen it. The silence of her victims and the ignorance of her neighbors were both necessary for her design to live. And so Margaret continued her science of unmaking, each child another experiment, each life another chance to refine what she saw as flawed. The farmhouse became a place not of nurture but of dismantling, a place where innocence was not protected but peeled away piece by piece until only bone and silence remained. Elias Jarvis lived his life above the floorboards, in fields and barns, with soil pressed deep into his skin and silence wrapped around his tongue. To the town, he was a simple man, bent to labor, a figure who spoke little but worked without pause. They believed his quiet nature came from weariness, the burden of running a farm on land that demanded too much. Yet those who later searched the house wondered if his silence had been chosen, not by exhaustion but by design. He did not enter the underground chambers once Margaret's work began. When neighbors visited, they noticed how Elias never spoke of the nursery, never carried a child in his arms, never lingered near the rooms that Margaret called her domain. Instead, he moved steadily through his chores, repairing fences, harvesting grain, tending to cattle. He lived in the open air, surrounded by sound, yet it seemed the silence of the farmhouse clung to him even outside. He avoided questions with shrugs, avoided suspicion with steady labor. People decided he was a husband who left household matters to his wife. It was easier to believe he was harmless than to imagine otherwise. But the structure of the underground rooms told another story. Years later, when investigators studied the ruins, they found walls cut with precision, beams placed with knowledge of weight and pressure, pits dug evenly as though mapped. The work bore the hand of someone skilled in farm construction, someone who knew how to carve earth for cellars, how to shape stalls for livestock, how to manage space for bodies kept in confinement. The chambers were not crude. They were built with care, with the same discipline a farmer used when designing barns for animals. And Elias was the only one who had such knowledge. If Elias built the rooms, his silence was more than complicity. It was participation. Every swing of his spade, every stone set into the walls, every chain fixed into beams might have been an act of obedience, or perhaps of fear. Some argued that Margaret's will dominated him, that he was too weak to resist her demands. Others believed he shared her vision, that his silence above the ground was not ignorance, but agreement. No one ever knew which truth lay behind his closed lips. Witnesses recalled that Elias often worked late into the night, lanterns glowing across the fields. They thought it was diligence, a man too restless to sleep. But perhaps those late hours were when he reinforced the chambers, shored up walls, sealed the underground against collapse. Some neighbors remembered seeing him haul timber from the barn, lengths far larger than needed for fences. Others recalled hearing the dull thud of earth being moved long after dark. They dismissed these memories at the time, telling themselves every farmer worked hard, every farm sounded strange at night. Only later did guilt creep in, when they realized what they might have heard. Elias never stopped Margaret. He never spoke against her rules, never raised his voice, never demanded that the children be freed. His silence became a shield for her. By never questioning, he allowed her work to appear normal. By never interfering, he gave her space to continue. Whether he feared her or loved her, whether he believed or doubted, his quietness was its own form of complicity. When the farmhouse burned, Elias's body was never found. Some claimed he perished inside, swallowed by the fire along with Margaret's secrets. Others whispered he fled into the night, carrying with him the weight of what he had built. The ruins offered no proof either way. All that remained were the chambers he may have carved, the precision that betrayed his hand, and the silence he left behind. In the story of Margaret's cruelty, his role was never clear, but his absence of words became as haunting as her endless devotion. From time to time, the Jarvis Farm opened its doors. Margaret knew trust was not something that could simply be claimed. It had to be staged, rehearsed, displayed like a performance. So when local officials, priests, or curious neighbors asked to see her nursery, she welcomed them with soft smiles and careful grace. She led them not into the earth below, but into the rooms above, where the stage had been set long before their arrival. She always chose which children to display. The weakest were hidden, kept below in silence, while the few who still appeared healthy were dressed in clean clothes, their hair brushed until it gleamed. Margaret lined them in neat rows on benches or at play tables, placing toys she never allowed them to use once the visitors had gone. She instructed them beforehand with whispers that made obedience feel like survival. Do not cry, do not speak unless asked, do not look at the door. For those who faltered, she had already taught punishment severe enough that they would not risk it. So when the guests entered, they saw only rows of strangely quiet children, their faces pale, but clean, their bodies still as though disciplined beyond their years. The visitors marveled at the order. Priests nodded with approval, remarking that Margaret's home was a haven of morality and restraint. Officials praised her for managing so many unwanted mouths without complaint, noting how calm and well-behaved the children were. Neighbors, though unsettled, admitted they had never seen such obedience. Yet behind their polite words was unease they could not name. Something about the silence pressed against them, something about the way the children stared at their hands instead of meeting eyes seemed wrong. But Margaret's presence, her soft voice, her careful composure, wrapped that unease in layers of reassurance. They left disturbed but convinced, telling themselves it was only their imagination. Margaret understood this dynamic perfectly. She knew that people preferred comfort over truth, that they would rather believe in her kindness than confront the disquiet that stirred inside them. She leaned into this weakness, speaking of sacrifice, of how difficult but noble her work was, of the calling she felt to shelter those no one else wanted. She described long nights tending to fevers, hours spent sewing clothes, prayers whispered over each bed. She painted herself as a mother not only to the children but to the town itself, bearing a burden on their behalf. And they believed her, because believing her meant they could leave without guilt. No visitor ever asked to go below the floorboards. No one questioned why the farmhouse seemed larger beneath than above, why faint drafts of lime and chemicals lingered in the air, why the silence felt heavier than any home should carry. They saw what they wanted to see, a model of charity, a miracle of order, and hurried away from the darker possibility. They smiled as they left, praising Margaret for her service, never realizing how deeply they had been manipulated. Margaret recorded these visits as triumphs. In her journals, she wrote of how easily appearances could be shaped, how quickly doubt could be smothered by politeness. She wrote that visitors were no different from the children. They too surrendered when guided into silence, when shown what they wanted to believe. Their smiles, she believed, were proof of her mastery, not only over the children, but over the minds of those who should have stopped her. She described it as another form of reflection, adults bending to her illusion just as children bent to her rules. The truth lay just beneath them in the underground chambers where children swayed in weighted cradles or wandered mirrored halls until their minds broke. But no guest ever saw that truth. They walked above it, shoes pressing against boards that muffled cries, eyes passing over seams in the floor that led to darkness. They carried the weight of that silence back into town, where they repeated Margaret's story of discipline and devotion. In this way, the community itself became complicit, each visit sealing her reputation as a saint, each smile another brick in the wall that hid the horror beneath. The visitors smiled, and then they left. But behind them, in the chambers they never saw, silence deepened. Margaret returned to her work with calm certainty, knowing the mask had held, knowing that once again evil had hidden itself behind the face of kindness. Margaret's work did not end with silence or with the slow unmaking of fragile bodies. For her, there was a final stage, a way to ensure that her vision endured beyond death. She feared rot more than she feared discovery. Decay in her mind was disorder, nature's rebellion against her control. So she turned to preservation, to the art of sealing children against time, freezing them in the state she believed was perfection. What others would have buried, Margaret placed into glass. She collected vessels with quiet patience, jars once meant for pickling, containers scavenged from neighbors who never asked what she needed them for. Large cylinders she convinced Elias to haul home under the claim of storing grain. In the underground chambers, she lined them along shelves and benches, their transparent walls gleaming in candlelight. To each she added the mixtures she had studied from old manuals and altered with her own experiments. Alcohol distilled from grain, lye water, strange combinations of herbs and salts. The liquid inside gave off sharp scents, stinging the nose and eyes, but to Margaret it smelled like safety. When a child slipped beyond silence, when hunger or reflection or the cradle's descent left them lifeless, Margaret refused to let their form vanish into the earth. She cleaned their bodies carefully, washing them as tenderly as if preparing them for sleep. She combed hair, clipped nails, straightened limbs. Then, with solemn care, she lowered them into the jars. Their faces pressed against the glass, pale skin glowing faintly beneath the liquid, eyes closed as though dreaming. Some curled small and fetal, others stretched in stiff repose. Each became another bloom in the strange garden Margaret was growing below her home. She gave each jar a label written in her precise script, not with their names, those she erased the moment they entered her care, but with words she believed defined their virtue: patience, purity, stillness, obedience. She dated each one as though keeping records for a holy archive, noting the day the child arrived, the day they were completed, and sometimes short remarks about their silence. The jars became not just containers but chapters in her doctrine, each one a story sealed in liquid, each one a proof that her vision had been achieved. Margaret called the chamber her garden of blossoms. She spoke to it as though it were alive, walking the rows of jars with hands folded like a mother in prayer. She whispered greetings, praised the stillness of each child, touched the glass as if stroking a cheek. To her mind, they were not dead. They were perfected. She believed she had saved them from corruption, plucked them from the chaos of a world that never wanted them, and preserved them as eternal blossoms in her underground sanctuary. Visitors who never saw this room left the house believing in her charity. Above, Margaret remained the gentle woman with calm eyes. Below, she drifted through her preserved children, carrying herself as though in a chapel. The candlelight flickered across glass walls, bending the faces inside, multiplying them until the chamber seemed filled with silent witnesses. Their empty presence did not disturb her. It comforted her. She saw in their unchanging forms the confirmation that her work could not be undone. The journals she kept grew more elaborate during this time. No longer simple notes of discipline, they became catalogs, lists of virtues, sketches of preserved forms, instructions for mixing solutions. Her handwriting was steady, almost graceful, as if she believed someone else might one day study her methods, as if she imagined a future where others would continue her work. She wrote of herself not as a woman but as a caretaker of blossoms, a gardener of silence, a protector of innocence remade. The language was tender, but the reality was grotesque. In time, the Garden of Blossoms became the heart of the underground chambers. Every child who entered the house carried the risk of joining it, their faces pressed forever against glass, their bodies floating in false serenity. Margaret believed she had conquered decay, but in truth she had only built a gallery of horror. The jars gleamed in the dark like lanterns, each one holding a life she had stolen, each one a silent reminder that kindness can be the mask of cruelty, and that beneath the calmest face can grow a collection of unspeakable devotions. Those who stepped into the Jarvis farmhouse during those years often left unsettled, though they could not explain why. The rooms above were orderly, the air faintly perfumed with herbs, the children they saw obedient and still. Yet beneath that calm surface, faint sounds sometimes reached their ears. Survivors later confessed that when they sat in the parlor or dined at Margaret's table, they could hear scratching beneath the boards as though nails dragged slowly across wood. Others recalled muffled cries, not loud but persistent, the kind of sound that clung to the edge of hearing and refused to fade. In the moment, they told themselves it was the house shifting, the wind pressing through cracks, the stir of vermin nesting in the walls. It was easier to believe in harmless noises than to admit they had heard voices calling from below. The ceiling of the underground nursery, lined with beams and thin seams of wood, was never perfect. Cracks allowed whispers to bleed upward, especially at night when silence in the house above was total. Guests sometimes froze in conversation, tilting their heads as faint thuds or scratching passed beneath them. Margaret, calm as ever, would continue speaking, pouring tea with steady hands, her expression unbroken. Her composure itself worked like a spell. People wanted to trust her face, not the noises their ears betrayed. And so they chose silence of their own, matching the silence she demanded below. The children who lived underground remembered pressing against the beams, their fingers clawing for light, their voices muffled by the thickness of soil above. They remembered crying into the cracks, believing someone might hear them, believing that if they shouted loud enough, the world would answer. But the world did not. The neighbors who visited heard only fragments of sound, and fragments were easy to dismiss. Each visitor convinced themselves it was nothing because to believe otherwise meant accepting that Margaret's sanctuary was a prison. Years later, when confessions surfaced, townsfolk admitted the guilt that never left them. Some recalled walking home with unease that sat in their stomachs like stone. They told themselves they had been foolish, superstitious, unwilling to trust goodness when it stood before them. They laughed it off then, but in the quiet of their own homes, the memory of those faint sounds returned, echoing through their sleep. They remembered how the walls of the Jarvis farmhouse seemed to hum with pressure, how even the most polite conversation felt strained by something hidden beneath. The truth was that the town wanted Margaret to be what she appeared. They wanted a woman of charity, a safe haven for unwanted children, a story of goodness in a place that often knew only hardship. They wanted her to be an answer to prayers, and so they blinded themselves to what their senses told them. When noises pressed through the floorboards, they pressed their doubts down deeper. When shadows flickered in corners, they told themselves it was candlelight. When silence grew too heavy, they told themselves it was peace. And in doing so, they became accomplices without ever touching a child. The survivors of the underground remembered this silence from above with bitterness. They said it was the loudest silence of all, heavier than Margaret's punishments, sharper than hunger. They said the worst cruelty was not being broken by her rules, but being ignored by those who could have stopped her. Every crack in the ceiling was a passage for their voices, but every ear that heard turned away. For generations, the town carried this stain. Even as the farmhouse fell into ruin, even after fire reduced much of it to ash, the memory of those sounds remained. Whispers from the cracked ceiling haunted them, reminders that evil is not only built by those who commit it, but by those who hear it and choose not to believe. The guilt lingered, passed through stories spoken in hushed tones by descendants who admitted that their grandparents once sat in the Jarvis home and heard something that should never have been ignored. The end of the Jarvis farm came not with screams or alarms, but with the quiet glow of fire spreading across the night. It began in silence, as though the land itself wished to consume the house without drawing attention, flames curling from windows with strange restraint, smoke drifting into the sky like a slow confession. By the time neighbors saw the glow, the house was already collapsing inward, beams groaning under the weight of fire, walls splitting as though the house had finally decided to reveal what it had held. No one knew who struck the first spark, and the question has lingered in every retelling since. Some whispered that Elias, weary of his wife's work, had set the fire himself, choosing flame as the only way to end what silence had preserved for too long. They imagined him pouring oil into corners, striking a match with trembling hands, perhaps believing fire would do what he could not, erase her cruelty. Others believed it was Margaret, aware that suspicion had begun to stir, desperate to cleanse her world of evidence. To her, fire would have been no different than lime or glass, another form of preservation, another ritual of control. Burning the house may have been her way of ensuring that no one could ever fully expose her truth. The farmhouse burned until nothing remained but a blackened skeleton. Neighbors gathered at a distance, some frozen by fear, others by guilt, watching as the home they had always mistrusted dissolved before their eyes. They spoke in hushed voices about the children they had once seen, about the faint sounds they had convinced themselves were nothing. Now, with smoke thick in their throats, they felt the weight of what they had ignored pressing harder than ever. But none dared enter the ruins until morning, when the flames had died and the ash cooled enough to touch. When authorities arrived, they sifted through the wreckage with caution, their boots sinking into charred soil, their hands blackened by soot. Beneath the collapsed beams and cracked stone walls, they began to uncover fragments too strange to dismiss as accident. Iron chains melted into twisted shapes, wooden cradles charred but still recognizable, their outlines hauntingly intact, and deeper still, in corners the fire had not fully consumed. They found glass jars that had burst from the heat, their liquid contents boiled away, their labels scorched but still legible in places. The words, patience, stillness, obedience, stared back at them in Margaret's steady script, evidence of something unspeakable. The official records that followed spoke only in vague terms. They mentioned remains found, artifacts preserved, fragments catalogued. But the details were sealed, deemed too disturbing to release. Whispers spread that investigators had seen rows of small bones arranged with unnatural care, that they had discovered journals written in a calm hand describing acts no sane mind could justify. Some said photographs were taken and hidden in locked archives, evidence so damning that releasing it would shatter the town's reputation forever. What was certain was that no one who searched the ruins left unchanged. The silence they carried afterward was not ignorance, but horror. The town built its own explanations to survive. Some claimed the children had been taken away before the fire, spirited off to distant homes as though to rewrite the story into something less unbearable. Others said the fire had cleansed the evil, that the house itself had chosen to burn, its silence finally broken by the only sound it could make. But beneath these stories lay the truth no one wanted to face, that the house had been a tomb long before it became ash, and that the fire had only revealed what they had allowed to endure. In the years that followed, the land where the Jarvis Farm once stood remained empty. No new house rose on the soil. Grass grew over the ruins, but the earth always seemed darker there, the silence heavier. People avoided the place, some out of fear, others out of shame. The fire had destroyed the Jarvis home, but it had not erased its memory. If anything, it had sealed it deeper into the town's conscience, leaving behind questions that could never be answered fully. Who set the fire? Why then and not sooner? And what horrors did the flames consume that will never be spoken aloud? The farm burned quietly, but its silence afterward was louder than fire itself. Decades after the fire, the story of the Jarvis Farm refused to die. What had once been whispers of suspicion hardened into fragments of evidence when old papers surfaced from forgotten trunks, when ledgers and journals hidden in attics or parish vaults were quietly uncovered. These records were never meant for public eyes, but time has a way of loosening secrets. Among the yellowed pages, investigators found catalogs Margaret had kept, lists of children written not with names but with dates and virtues. Words like patience, stillness, and purity marked columns where numbers once stood, each entry suggesting another child preserved, another life stripped of identity and rewritten by her hand. The handwriting was calm, steady, almost graceful, as if she had been documenting nothing more than household tasks. But beneath that calm surface lived the record of atrocities too precise to dismiss. Other documents hinted at the hidden nursery. Reports written in soft tones described unusual practices, praising Margaret for her discipline while noting with unease the silence of her wards. Some mentioned cradles suspended by chains explained away as experiments in rest. Others spoke of mirrored chambers that were said to teach self-reflection, their descriptions cloaked in the language of moral care. Even then, the writers seemed unwilling to admit what they had witnessed, cloaking the horror in euphemism, covering the truth in layers of respectability. These partial accounts, combined with the catalogs, painted only fragments of a picture. But the fragments were damning enough to suggest the shape of what had been hidden beneath the floorboards. As these discoveries emerged, the town wrestled with its legacy. There were calls to build a memorial on the land, to mark the site where so many children had vanished into silence. Others resisted, arguing that naming the horror would bring shame, that some truths should remain buried. Meetings were held in hushed rooms, voices lowered, faces turned away when the subject grew too heavy. No memorial was ever built. Instead, the land remained untouched, its soil heavy with memory but unmarked by stone or plaque. The story dissolved into folklore, told in fragments by descendants who admitted uneasily that their parents or grandparents had once heard sounds in the Jarvis home and had done nothing. For the community, silence became both a shield and a wound. It had protected Margaret in her lifetime, allowing her to work beneath the mask of kindness. And it protected the town afterward, allowing them to carry on without facing the full truth of what they had allowed. But the wound of that silence lingered, passed through generations like a shadow, leaving behind unease that never lifted. Children growing up in the town were warned not to wander near the ruins, told stories of ghosts whispering beneath the soil, of eyes pressed against cracks in the ground. Folklore softened the horror, but it also preserved it in another form, ensuring it was never fully forgotten. Philosophers and historians who later studied the case reflected on how evil thrives when wrapped in innocence. Margaret Jarvis had been the face of kindness, the woman who soothed grieving mothers, who offered charity to the poor, who smiled with calm restraint. But behind that mask, she built chambers of silence, designed machines of control, and catalogued children as if they were specimens. Her cruelty was not wild but methodical, not chaotic but disciplined, carried out in a way that appeared rational and even holy to those who did not look closely. This was her true danger. She never looked like evil. She looked like safety. And so the question remains, carried into the present. How many times has silence protected cruelty? How many faces of kindness have hidden designs too dark to imagine? The Jarvis Farm may have burned, but the pattern it revealed has not disappeared. Evil does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers softly, smiles gently, and hides in plain sight. It thrives in silence, and silence is often given freely because facing the truth is harder than believing the mask. What do you think? Could this happen again?